Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a truly fascinating one for you today. We're unpacking a pretty provocative text that outlines a massive, stark socioeconomic contrast. We're talking about the deep divide between a global luxury empire and the foundational agricultural sector that literally feeds us. It's essentially a conceptual battle between an economic system built on hyperconsumption and one built on fundamental everyday sustenance. We're going to explore this whole framework by digging directly into the data and the arguments laid out in our source material. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the protector versus the predator. Second, scaling the predatory empire. Third, the extremes of extravagance. Fourth, the debt-based economy. Fifth, the elite and Epstein. And finally, we'll wrap up with the final reckoning. Let's get started. So part 1, the protector versus the predator. Right out of the gate, the text establishes this foundational, honestly kind of shocking dichotomy. It asks us to look at the world through two completely opposing forces, the nurturing force of agriculture and the consuming force of modern capitalist vice. And the author grounds this philosophy in a pretty grim reality. Picture this. On one side, you have struggling agricultural workers, exemplified by farmers who are literally forced to throw away essential healthy food like tomatoes because market prices crash to a mere 3 rupees per kilogram. They literally cannot even recover their basic costs to grow the food. But then, on the exact opposite side, we have what the source calls a staggering $4 trillion predatory economy. This is a massive global system where trillions are just poured into luxury goods, meat, and alcohol. The argument here is that our current system grossly undervalues actual life-sustaining production while heavily rewarding extreme consumption. Now, to understand the farmer's side of this massive divide, the text introduces something it calls the nurturing mindset. It refers to this as the compost culture or cod culture of agriculture. In this specific worldview, the farmer is seen as the true protector. Why? Well, because in agriculture, even the waste, like the rotting organic matter, is patiently turned into compost to generate new life and feed society. It's a beautifully cyclical, life-giving process. The source contrasts this directly with the predatory system, which it claims basically just consumes, extracts, and leaves a trail of destruction behind.
All right, moving on to part 2, scaling the predatory empire.
To really grasp the macro scale of what the text categorizes as the 3 vice industries, we're going to look at some numbers, starting with the Indian market. The text uses 3 terms here: Shabab, representing luxury, Kabab, representing meat, and Sharab, representing alcohol and narcotics. Look at the absolute billions flowing into these specific sectors domestically. We've got alcohol sitting at $148 billion, meat at $60 billion, and luxury at $30 billion. The author is pointing out a really glaring paradox here. While the state collects billions in excise revenue and actively promotes this liquid economy, the foundational farmers producing actual sustenance are struggling just to survive.
But hold on, because when the text zooms out to the global stage, the numbers become truly mind-boggling. Globally, this triad empire of luxury, meat, and alcohol is valued at up to $4 trillion. $4 trillion. To put that completely massive number into perspective, this single consumption-based empire surpasses the entire gross domestic product of many major nations. It is a massive, highly structured global matrix of wealth.
Which brings us nicely to section 3, the extremes of extravagance. So remember that farmer throwing away tomatoes for 3 rupees? Keep that in the back of your mind and contrast it with what this wealth buys at the very, very top of the economic ladder. In the alcohol sector, the source points out a bottle of Limoncello encrusted with giant diamonds that costs $44 million. In the meat sector, you can buy a single taco infused with gold flakes for $25,000. And in luxury, how about a night at the Atlantis Royal Mansion for $100,000? The text is highlighting a super crucial theme here. The monetary value of these items doesn't come from any actual sustenance they provide. It comes from the diamonds, the gold, and the sheer absurd display of predatory purchasing power. But according to the source, all this extravagance carries a really heavy, hidden toll. The text details severe socio-environmental destruction going on behind the scenes. For example, it notes that producing just 1 single kilogram of Wagyu beef wastes roughly 15,000 liters of water. That's water that agricultural societies would carefully conserve. It also mentions practices like feeding cattle sake mash just to tenderize their meat, basically prioritizing extreme luxury over natural processes. And it even points to those $100,000 a night suites we mentioned, which are sometimes decorated with dead sharks preserved in formaldehyde. The author views all of these examples not as signs of advanced development, but as glaring symbols of deep moral and environmental decay.
This leads us right into part 4, the debt-based economy. So, you have to ask yourself the obvious question. If this money isn't actually coming from real, life-sustaining production like agriculture, where on earth is it coming from? Well, the author breaks it down into 3 steps. Step 1, fiat currency is essentially just digitally printed by central banks without any physical backing. Step 2, this action creates massive national debts, which are then conveniently passed down to the general public through taxes. And step 3, this entire system effectively siphons wealth away from the real producers, like our tomato farmers, and funnels it straight up to the top 1%, the corporate elites and the hedge funds holding that debt. The text frames this entire empire as nothing more than a massive artificial financial bubble. And the text provides some pretty stark figures to illustrate just how big this bubble is. The U.S. national debt alone is sitting at over $34 trillion, while total global debt surpasses a frankly unimaginable $300 trillion. The author argues that this colossal, totally artificial debt is the true engine funding all the extravagance we just talked about. It's essentially a system of borrowing against the future and stripping resources from the present.
Next up, Section 5, the elite and Epstein.
So, who are the actual architects of this system? The author connects this economic engine of extreme consumption directly to the global power elite. And to show just how deep this goes, the text uses the Epstein files as the ultimate symbol of this predatory mindset. It categorizes the known visitors to the island to make a point. It lists global politicians, whom the author claims were drawn into this web of vice so they could be manipulated. It lists tech billionaires, framing them as hypocrites who preach modernism to us while engaging in dark exploitation themselves. It points to academics and Nobel laureates who are allegedly funded to research genetics and immortality for the ultra-rich. And finally, celebrities, who basically act as the cultural propagators of this entire lifestyle. The source uses this list to argue that the people at the very top of this global system view human dignity with the exact same disposable, predatory attitude as they view the environment. In fact, the source drops a really powerful quote that sums this all up perfectly. The author states, "They claim to be the most developed, yet at the ground level, it is the most underdeveloped parasitic mindset." This right here is the absolute core thesis of the source material. It's a searing critique of the hypocrisy of a system that masks deep moral and ecological decay behind a glittering facade of modern luxury and development. And that brings us to our final section, the final reckoning. After dissecting this massive global structure, the author takes a really long view of human history to deliver a final philosophical takeaway. The text argues that predatory empires, literally no matter how wealthy, how technologically advanced, or how deeply entrenched in debt they become, they inevitably collapse under their own weight. They consume themselves. But in stark contrast, it is the agricultural civilization, that protector mindset that patiently turns waste into life-giving compost, that actually endures the test of time. The farmer, despite all the struggles, represents the true foundation of human survival. As we wrap up today's explainer, the text leaves us with a lingering, pretty profound question to consider based on everything we've just covered. What truly endures? A $4 trillion artificial empire built on debt and extreme consumption, or the foundational agricultural civilization that quietly feeds the world? It's a highly provocative thought, and one that asks us to seriously reflect on the systems we participate in and support every single day. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this fascinating source material. Stay curious, and I'll catch you next time.